Since we're waiting for Avichal, do you want to, I don't think you need the intro, but do you want to introduce yourself
happy to introduce
or whatever
myself.
you want to introduce?
Yes. So I'm Haseeb. I'm a meme coin KOL. I'm here. No, I'm a managing partner at Dragonfly, which is a global crypto investment firm. We've invested a decent amount into crypto AI. It's a space that I've been spending a lot of my personal time in, trying to learn more about what's going on in the space. I'm by no means an expert. I think one of the things that we're all learning very quickly is that AI is moving really fast, and it's really hard to stay on top of everything that's happening. I'm sure many of you feel the same way. But as an investor, I'm trying to get a better understanding of where crypto and AI can work together and how much of this space is bullshit.
Awesome. Yeah, actually, I remembered last year, Token 2049, and also maybe even East Denver. We actually do not have a lot of AI-focused, crypto AI-focused events. But for this token, I think it's like plenty of them. So it's quite interesting to see the explosion of and also interest of crypto AI. That being said, I would really curious to pick your brain based on the current landscape. What do you understand? What do you see in the crypto AI? What do you think seems to be already working, and what is more like bubble-ish?
What is bubble-ish?
And also, bubble-ish could be bubble-ish for now, but might be real later.
Bubble-ish for now, you say? Okay.
Yeah. Actually, you have Avichal.
Oh, there we go. There we go. Hello. All right. First question. What is bubble-ish for now in AI, crypto AI?
Apologies for being late.
No, you're good.
No problem.
Well, before we start, some people here may know I just come to these to disagree with Haseeb. So what do you believe? So I can disagree with
No,
it.
you're going first, so I get last mover advantage. You're late, so I get to go last.
So what was the question?
Question is, what in crypto AI right now is working, and what is bubble-ish?
Oh, everything's a bubble. I'm going to make it easy for you. You got to take the other side now.
Easy.
Okay.
Everything is a bubble. That's
everything's a bubble.
You're supposed to say everything is not a bubble.
Everything is not a bubble. I think that is clearly painting with too broad of a brush. So one, I think if you look at the valuations right now in crypto AI, there are a few things I think right now that do seem quite overvalued. So maybe BitTensor or what else is it? Render. Some of these valuations, you see that there's not that much utilization of the underlying networks. I wrote a tweet about this recently that I have started repeating more and more, which is that tokens are really good at bootstrapping supply, but they can do almost nothing for demand. And right now, the biggest thing you see is that there's not a lot of demand for these networks. So for the most part, you can aggregate tons and tons of GPUs, but these GPUs tend to be kind of crappy SLAs, right? They're sort of low-end GPUs, not in high-quality data centers. You can't get many of them together working at very high efficacy, and there's not that much demand for that, despite the fact that there's this huge GPU shortage. That being said, I think most of the stuff that's happening in crypto AI is relatively new. Most of the stuff is not launched yet, and I think there's a lot of space to explore in the AI space, and there's a lot of new stuff that's happening in the AI world that's going to keep evolving. So I think the first obvious things that happen in any cycle, like if you go back to 2017 during the ICO bubble.
I would note also all scams.
You sorry?
That was also all scams.
There were a lot of scams. There were a lot of scams. But if you remember, in the beginning of the ICO bubble, like when people were like, okay, I'm going to build a crypto startup using an ICO, what were the first ideas that people had?
Scams.
It was like, Uber on the blockchain, Airbnb on the blockchain, right? They find some, like, I'm going to build Amazon on the blockchain. They just find sort of this Web 2 analogy, and they shove a blockchain on it, shove a token on it. And that's a lot of what's happening right now in crypto AI, is people are using these sort of loose analogies, and they're trying to graft a token onto something. But it takes time to figure out what are the real crypto-native intersections where crypto does make sense, where incentives do make sense to graft onto AI.
I agree with that.
So I win. He's saying I win.
Just a quick
well, round one goes to a seat.
To put a maybe more nuanced point on it, I do think most of them are scams right now. I think most of them will not work for the reason you said. It's like a little bit too, like, let's just throw a blockchain on it, decentralize all the things. Now, the idea is maybe directionally correct, but usually what happens in these kinds of market cycles is, to your point on 2017, like a lot of the ideas were the right ideas. It's like, oh, we're going to have DeFi one day, we'll have stablecoins one day, you'll be able to do like, invoice factoring on chain, and one day you'll have BlackRock will show up, and you can like do remittances, and you can do checkout, all this stuff. So the ideas were the right ideas, but the infrastructure is not ready yet, and it took a couple of years of building. There's a saying we talk about internally a lot with founders and with LPs, which is, by the way, none of this is financial advice. You should not listen to anything we say. But you know, people dramatically overestimate what's possible in 2 years and dramatically underestimate what's possible in 10 years. And so right now we're in the part of the cycle where everybody thinks all this stuff is going to work, and so there's all this optimism, and then reality sort of hits. You realize, oh, actually, there's reason that people just stay on Amazon or on Azure, and like getting businesses to actually move their stuff over is really hard, or that actually like heterogeneous GPU stuff is like super interesting, but actually there's a bunch of technical complexity to abstract that away, or oh, it turns out you know, like the use case that we thought, which is going to be, I don't know, I want to pick something random like protein folding, right? It's like, oh, it needs some more work at like the fine-tuning model layer, you know, foundational model layer or training layer before it's actually going to be able to use, you know. So like all these, the reality kind of hits, and you don't know what the reality is until you're like 2 years into it. And I think we're just kind of in the process of the reality of 2 years hitting. And so in 10 years, all this stuff will work. Probably in 2 years, we're all like, a little over our skis, and none of this stuff will work. And then the challenge, I think, for founders is how do you build an organization and a team and a project and a culture that can survive for 10 years? Because you got to get through that like year 3 to year 7. Like I'll give you a concrete example of how this has manifested in a totally different industry that might make it more tangible for people. I was an investor in a company called Cruise, which does self-driving cars, in 2014. And you got the first 80% really fast, which I would liken to a lot of what's happening with a lot of crypto AI right now. It's like, oh my God, look, you can like get it up and running, and you can have this like cluster of GPUs that nobody's using, and it kind of works. And here's a prototype. That was kind of what Cruise was. You got like 80% self-driving in like the first 9 months, and then the reality of how hard it was going to be to get the next 10 or 20% really started to hit. Anybody who's written code knows it's like that last 5 or 10% actually takes 80% of the time. And so by 2016, it was really hard for them to raise. Like the Series B was like just a grind. They ended up having to sell the company to GM, not because they wanted to. It was a $1 billion exit, which was kind of shocking, I think, at the time for the seed investors. Were like, wow, I can't believe they sold for $1 billion, given that 6 months ago nobody wanted to fund them. But it was actually really out of desperation. Like they were just kind of like, I don't think this is not working. Like this is so much harder than we thought. Fast forward to 2024, you can literally take a self-driving car around San Francisco. Like 10 years later, literally almost to the day, right, to the year, you can take an actual self-driving car around San Francisco. And so for me, it was like the perfect manifestation of like 2 years in, nobody wanted to fund this thing, and the reality of the startup hit. And to Kyle's credit, and the Waymo team's credit, and the Zoox team credit, like they just all kept grinding for 10 years, and they built a culture around having their people stick around for philosophical reasons and why they want to do it. And now those things actually work. So I suspect the same thing will happen here. But
I also want to issue a word of caution against like, okay, just grind on this thing for 10 years, and then eventually, magic will happen.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of people in crypto who fall into those kinds of traps. So if you remember, Aragon is probably the best example of this, where it's like, okay, DAOs are going to be a thing.
Yeah.
And so these guys just raise, whatever, 100 million in ICO, and they're just still just like a Roomba hitting a wall, being like, when are DAOs going to take over the world?
Yeah.
And when we do, finally, our product's going to matter. And the thing that's really important about startups in general is that, if you remember the metaverse hype, that was 2021, 2022. There were a lot of startups I saw that were they got really excited about a vision of the future, and they started building kind of too many steps ahead on the chessboard.
Yeah,
right. So you're just like, okay, the metaverse is going to happen. Mark Zuckerberg believes it. Everybody seems to agree, and so I'm going to create a wardrobe for the metaverse so that you can look at all your metaverse clothes. And I'm like, motherfucker, we don't even have clothes in the metaverse. Like, the metaverse isn't even here yet. We don't have clothes in the metaverse. Why are you building this? And somebody like that might hear, well, Cruise, they took 10 years. Maybe I should just stick it out. And the thing about building a startup, and this is, I see a lot of this in AI as well, is that a startup needs customers.
Yeah, I agree.
It needs users. It needs feedback. It needs a reward signal, right? Think about a machine learning model. A startup is a great learning algorithm, but it needs a reward function. And if it doesn't have that reward function, you cannot gradient descent to building the right thing. And so if you are building, like in AI, many people are excited about, Brian Armstrong is talking about agents paying each other, and that's really cool. It's like, great, I'm going to build, a way for agents to be able to engage in long-term banking, or, I don't know, something like very, very far. Like, agents aren't working yet. So like, okay, building maybe the chassis so that agents can start working, okay, fine, I can see that. But if you're building too many steps ahead on the chessboard, you're just like staring into the clouds, hoping that you're going to end up building a bridge in the right direction.
So 2 thoughts on that. So normally I would agree with that. I think one way to think about that, like the adage is being too early is the same as being wrong. Like, you're just wasting your time, right? And I agree, too, that, like, especially technologists, like people who are here who tend to understand the technology, tend to think it's going to happen a lot quicker than it does. And so then they build too many steps ahead. And, like, you really should just ADIQ it. It's just like, who is going to pay me today for a thing, and how much are they going to pay me, and how many of those customers do I need to make sure that I don't run out of money and I can keep financing my business, even if nobody ever gives me money again. And if you can solve that problem, you probably have a shot. If you don't have an answer to that, you probably don't have a shot. So it's actually kind of ADIQ. I will say, though, what I think is interesting about something like foundational research in some of these areas, and there's a relatively small number of people that are in this category, but you might be in this category. And if you are confused about whether or not you're in this category, you're not. But if it's very clear that you are, then you know you are. For those kinds of things, I would argue that you might be able to get away with a pretty, hefty raise. I'm not talking like 100 million. I'm talking like 10 or 15 million, enough to finance a small team to figure this out for a few years. Example of this might be something like standing up a new L1, like Solana or Near raised enough to kind of get through the bear cycle and grind for 4 years and get off the ground. There are some examples of those things that I think will happen in AI.
I would put that pretty different, right? People who are building L1s know that people want L1s. Right, when people were building that first generation of Solana and Near and all those things, people knew Ethereum was a problem and that there was demand for new infrastructure.
Yes.
So that feels to me very different. I think OpenAI is a good example of what you're talking about.
OpenAI is also a good example. Yeah, it was not at all clear. It was a research project for a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, Ethereum was like that too. Right, it was a little bit like like maybe smart contracts are on top of L1 or a thing. So it can work, but it's pretty rare, and you're taking a very, very difficult risk-adjusted return as a founder, and it's especially if you're a first-time founder. If you're not already, I mean, it's, you could argue Tesla was like that. You could argue SpaceX is like that. You could argue Boom Supersonic is like that. Cruise was like that. But actually, if you look at most of those founders, like the Cruise founder Kyle, he'd sold Twitch for $1 billion already. Right? Elon Musk had already sold PayPal at Tesla. Vitalik was already Bitcoin rich. Right? Like so. It's a lot easier to do that if you've already made some money, because then you have the patience to sort of take that bet. But it's a very, very tough bet for most people to take. You should ask Haseeb if you have one of those types of businesses. He'll be very honest with you and tell you that you don't.
Next question.
Mic on now. Yeah, I totally agree with your point where actually people tend to underestimate long-term as overestimate like short-term, and also they tend to apply whatever is already working. Actually, example, internet came out, everyone is so excited. Even Forbes, Fortune, they were so excited. So they're trying to put their content online. The first thing they did is they put an entire paper magazine online and then update it once a month. And then later on, they started to learn how the internet works and started to dynamically update the content, etc. That's quite interesting. That being said, actually, Avichal, just wanted you to do a quick intro of yourself.
Oh, okay. We jumped right into it. Okay. Hey, everybody. My name is Avichal. I'm one of the founders at Electric Capital. We do primarily crypto investing, but actually my background's in machine learning and AI. That's what I studied at school. I worked on Google Search, Google Ads, Facebook Newsfeed. So I've worked on kind of large-scale machine learning systems. And have been in crypto for a few years now. We're fortunate to be early seed investors in Near and a bunch of other protocols and businesses in crypto land that have gone to do well. And we are doing a bunch of AI investing as well. Our kind of approach is we do mostly early stage, $1 to $10 million checks. About 33 people, but we have 20 engineers on staff. And our approach is to like write a bunch of code and build stuff and ship data systems and just try to kind of get our hands dirty to understand what's actually happening. And we think it makes us better investors. So for example, with a lot of this AI stuff, we have 4 engineers in-house that are building a bunch of tooling, and the prompt that I gave that engineering team was, no pun intended, was what happens over the next 10 years is this stuff is going to get really good. So what does our business look like if we manage 10x the capital? We've raised about somewhere between $1.5 billion and $2 billion at this point. What happens, what would our business look like if we managed 20 billion instead of 2 billion, but we didn't hire anybody else? No more hiring allowed. We're at 30 people, but we managed 10x the capital. What does our business look like? And I actually think that's going to happen over the next 5 to 7 years. Like I think instead of hiring finance people and ops people, we're just going to hire GPUs, and it's going to be fantastic for the business actually because people get more expensive over time, and GPUs and teraflops get cheaper over time. So actually, like our gross margin effectively gets better. We can run a more scaled business, and so effectively, I don't want to fire anybody. We have great people, so we'll just manage 10x. The business will just be 10x bigger without hiring anybody else. And so we have people, we're building a lot of stuff internally and automating workflows, and it's like pretty remarkable how good some of this stuff already is. I'll give you a concrete example, which I think is super cool, which goes to your point, which is like solve real problems, and I would totally pay somebody to do this. We have to process a lot of invoices from vendors, real pain in the butt, because we have 5 funds. These things we have to be attributed to the right funds properly and accounted for properly, and we have to make sure all that accounting is happening. It's usually stuck in PDFs, which is a real pain in the butt. And so we get these emails coming in all the time to our invoice and then some finance person has to download the PDF, open it, try to figure out which fund it's for, then attribute it. And sometimes it's like a legal invoice that actually goes to 3 different funds. And then you got to put it into an Airtable, and then that gets copy pasted out once a day to our fund admin because you want checks and balances. You don't want just some finance person on your team being able to wire money to themselves. There's a whole workflow here. So we built a little bot on top of Llama 3.1, 4 or 5B. It's pretty sweet. It downloads a PDF, reads it, figure out which fund it should be attributed to, what the dollar amounts are, inserts in an Airtable, summarizes it once a day, sends it to the finance team and the fund admin. And what used to take it's 2-3 hours a day of work, just because the sheer number of funds and vendors that we have is now 30 seconds. And so we've replaced a quarter of a person already, just with one workflow. And I think there's probably 50 workflows like that in our business. And so if there was some company that were just yo, we just do this for funds and now you don't have to hire people, and why don't you pay us, and I'll pick a number, $250,000 a year, some number that sounds large, I'd be like, actually, you're replacing 2 people, so I'm still ROI positive. It's not costing me $500,000. I'll give you $250. Let's split the difference. And so you wouldn't need a lot of these customers, right, to all of a sudden have a really profitable business. So anyway, that's how we think about it at a high level on the AI side. We're playing with this already, and I do think it'll intersect with crypto in all sorts of interesting ways. But I'm going to have a set of biases here based on all that. Okay, long intro, sorry.
Yeah, very detailed, very good intro. So my next question is, seems like you both kind of agree, this need to have real application, and seem open crypto AI seem to be quite promising, but at the same time futuristic. So I'm wondering, based on your perspective, it's hard to predict the future, but it's more order of magnitude or the scale. How many years or decades do you think you'll start to have more real use cases for the 2 technology to merge? And also for the technology to start to actual merge, it could have breakthrough from either side, right? Something happened to AI, start to make sense to use blockchain, or something happened to blockchain, start to make sense to use for AI to use blockchain. What do you think will be the breakthrough from each side?
Go first.
I kind of hate this question. Sorry, no, you're fine. It's not towards you. I sin, not the sinner. I think, in a way, so it's obviously difficult to predict exactly where crypto is going to evolve and what new primitives are going to be interesting to AIs. But on some level, when you think about AI, I think this is a way people can often fall into a trap when they're thinking about AI. Is that obviously what we're doing right now with AI is we're trying to simulate human intelligence as best we can, and ideally surpass human intelligence. But for now, at least just simulate it. And to that extent, when you start getting AIs that are good enough to engage in complex activities in commerce, in software engineering and creative actions. Like Avichal was mentioning, the end game is that you start supplanting some of the work that human beings are doing, and you get the AIs to do it. So on the whole, we have more work getting done. Okay, so it's probably worth imagining. Let's imagine that GPT-6 comes along, maybe in 5 years, and GPT-6 is so good that we finally have a model that's as smart as a capable L5 Google engineer shipping code, right? That's how good GPT-6 is. And GPT-6 costs a lot of money. Let's say it's let's say it's $100 million, or sorry, let's say $100 billion training run to get GPT-6. Okay, let's imagine that. And it costs a lot of money. But if you're a company, you can hire 10,000 people to run, or hire 10,000 GPT-6s, roughly at the cost of, let's say, 10,000 employees. Right, that's how much it costs to just run the infra. Okay, now you've got 10,000 L5s at Google. That's what you got after all this investment, all this money, all this development. We finally have that. Let's imagine that Google was to announce that 10,000 L5s died in an explosion. How much faster do you think the world would advance? Or how much slower do you think the world would advance if we lost 10,000 L5s at Google? This is probably not very much, right? It actually takes a lot to make the world move much faster than it's already moving, right? Like imagine that we had so many AIs that was the size of the country of Germany. That's how many AIs we had operating in real time building stuff. If you deleted the country of Germany, how much slower do you think human progress would develop? Probably you wouldn't even notice if Germany stopped existing. You know, it turned out there was just a black hole where Germany existed. The reason why I bring all that up is that my assumption of what AIs are going to want to do with blockchains, like why blockchains solve problems for AIs, is the same reason why it solved problems for us. Like why does blockchain solve problems for humans? The answer is that, well, humans need to coordinate. Humans need to agree on stuff. Humans can be adversarial against each other. Humans can lie to each other. Humans can be malicious. And blockchains solve a trust problem. And that trust problem will also be had by AIs relative to each other. And in the same way, you know, what is so cool about the fact that you have permissionless finance through crypto? Well, in large part, the answer is that because you're not allowed to do a lot of this stuff through banks. If we could have done all of this without ever asking anybody for permission, and the banks were just like, oh, yeah, you want to program over money? Totally. You want to send money instantaneously anywhere? Yeah, go ahead. Then Bitcoin would never needed to get created. Ethereum would have never needed to get created. And so on some level, the reason why AIs are going to use crypto and why that intersection is going to be as rife as it is for us human beings is because AIs will also be intelligent, but they will also be subject to the same constraints that we are, with respect to how they coordinate, with respect to how they interact with governments, with respect to how they interact with money. That is my base case assumption for why this stuff matters. Now, if it's also helpful along the way to create GPU marketplaces and inference networks and this and that, then awesome. That's also there. But the main thing is that AIs are going to be active participants in the world if we accomplish where we're going. That's why they'll use blockchains.
I think a really simple litmus test here is like, can you explain what the value prop is without using the word blockchain? And if you can't, then you probably have a problem. And if you can explain, what problem you're solving, then maybe you're onto something. I will take maybe a little bit of the other side of this, which is I think that probably not in the next 2 years, but maybe on the other side of GPT-6, if you just look at compute costs and kind of how they tend to trend down, I think what happens is actually, yeah, you could run, maybe in 2 or 3 years, you can run 10,000 L5s for the cost of 10,000 humans, but you play that out 10 years, and you can run 10 million L5s for the cost of 10,000 humans, and that's where this stuff gets really interesting. It's like everybody can have an army of 1,000 L5s. Like, what does the world look like then? And I think that's the interesting point, but that's several years away, but it'll happen. I think that my mental model for what these agents are is the closest analog we have sounds a little weird, and if anybody's heard me talk about this before, I apologize, it's redundant, but the closest analog I think we have is the creation of the corporation, which actually, if you think about it, was a pretty breakthrough technology. So for those that don't know, the Joint Stock Corporation was created in about 1650. So the Dutch East India Company says, oh, it'd be cool if we could put a bunch of money in a place and then pay people to go do stuff and take risk. And this separation of sort of risk, the personal risk you're taking, the person doing the work, from the capital risk was a really important breakthrough, actually, right? That's why that company was so successful. It could go pursue things that the cottage industry couldn't. Like when your own personal capital is on the line, it sort of constrains what you can do. And so from 1650 to 1850, you had to go to a king, basically, to get a charter to start a corporation. And in 1850, the UK and the US, approximately, were like, you know what? Why do you have to go to the king? Maybe you should just file some paperwork with the government and create a corporation. And there were some really interesting debates around this time, if you go back and read the debates. People talked about things like, oh, well, do these things have rights? Do they pay taxes? Do they have free speech? Is there liability? What if a corporation does a thing that kills a human? Who goes to jail? What are the rules? And there's really interesting debates, actually, too, around things like political speech. So people are worried, wait, do these things get too powerful and start to influence our politics and our governments? And, do we want that? It's really, really interesting debates in, 1840 to 1860. So these things get passed, and actually it's a really big breakthrough because now you can have capital formation, right? You can have people pooling capital to build things like railroads and factories. So it's a big enabler of the Industrial Revolution, in addition to other technologies, obviously. I think we haven't really had to think about these things literally in almost 200 years because now what we have is a new type of an entity, right? We have a new entity which is not a human, and it is not a corporation, and it does not live in a jurisdiction. It lives in the cloud. But it can interface with humans, and it can custody money, and it can take actions, and it can talk to humans, and it can be a counterparty to a transaction, and it can pay humans to do things in the real world. And we don't really have a framework for this. We don't really have an idea for how does liability work here? In what jurisdiction is an AI liable? Is the person who wrote the code liable? Does it pay taxes? Like, can I just give all my money to an AI and it does a bunch of short-term trading and I don't have to pay any taxes? Right, there's like actually a bunch of fundamental questions to figure out about these things. And those fundamental questions, I think, in the same way that, like, if you look at the economy today, yes, there's a lot of consumer businesses, but there are huge numbers of enterprise businesses because enterprises just have different problems than humans. I think AIs will just have a bunch of different problems from humans. And the interfaces that make sense for AIs will be different. So I'll give you a concrete example. Like, micropayments on the internet never really made sense to me. It's just like, I think it's too complicated for the human brain. Like, it's just like weird to say I'm paying like 0.006 cents to this blog to read their article. It's like a weird interface for a human because humans don't think that way. But that might make a lot of sense for an AI to essentially pay as you go for some sort of service and just be like, yeah, I'll give you like fractions of a penny to do a thing. That might be the right interface for an AI, right? So I think there's actually, once we get to the other side in 7 to 10 years, and you can just buy 1,000 L5 engineers to do whatever you want, I think that will open up a whole new surface area for problems, and some of those problems will need crypto and blockchain to be solved, but I think it's a little early for that, but I think you could probably reason through what some of those things are today and start thinking about what the precursors to those things are. You know, maybe the way to think about that is like Netflix. Like, Netflix did a great job of this. They started mailing DVDs before streaming happened, but they had line of sight to what the business would look like pretty quick. They're like, oh, actually, people want movies, and we'll just change how people get the movies. So they're probably, that's how I think about it today. It's like that world happens in 10 years, but what is like the mailing in of the DVD version of that business today?
So given the time we have, I have one last question. Is more around like the possibility on the potential government or public sector to push for actually AI and blockchain to merge. So one thing is like we start to see for instance, the European Union have quite some regulation regarding data privacy, like all the consumer product have their specification available. So the one natural solution a lot of people start to do is actually blockchain. And also you have Italy is like actually banned ChatGPT for data privacy reason for 3 months. And then actually some of the companies start to explore potentially using blockchain to solve some of the issues and to be more compliant with the regulation, especially Europeans taking the lead there for different properties like data privacy, privacy preservation, traceability, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think it's possible, like there's some adoption can potentially force or push the AI company to use more blockchain that come from the European Union or other governments?
I feel like we might agree on this one.
Go for it.
I think the government is unlikely to figure out the solution to this. Most governments, actually Singapore might be one of the few exceptions. Most governments are not run by people who understand technology. And generally, if they try to do things that pick winners or try to form markets in a particular direction, they tend to screw it up more than they tend to actually create opportunities. Now, the exception to this is if you incentivize people to actually figure it out. So what you do is you say, I don't know the answer, and I'm not going to try to pick a technical winner or technical opinion here, but we need to sort of let people who understand that figure that out. One concrete example here. I think there was a lot of thinking done around the early internet, and a bill in the U.S. was passed called the Telco Act of '96 under the Clinton administration. So actually, like, reasonably well thought out. And basically what they said was, you know what, there's like a couple of things we do understand about this stuff, which is it's different than radio or TV. And so it doesn't make sense for you to have to go to the FTC and go get a radio license to put content up on the internet. That seems weird. So we're not going to make you do that. And you know what? These internet forums feel a little bit different than newspapers, so we're not going to hold them accountable to the same editorial standards. So there's like some early thinking, but they didn't prescribe the solution. They just said, you know what? We just know some of this stuff is different, so we'll get rid of some barriers, and then we'll let the market kind of figure it out for the next X years. Now, I'd argue the mistake that they made was that they basically said, we're not going to touch it for 30 years, and that was a mistake. We should have gone back and like put some rules in place. But I think that was roughly the right approach. I don't think that's the approach governments are going to take right now. I'm sure you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that, but I think even more so, it's not even just that the people who are running these governments don't understand technology. It's that, I mean, that's true, but it's also true that nobody knows where this is going. Venture capitalists don't know where it's going. Technologists don't know where it's going. Everybody has their best guess. But the reality is that so much of what people predicted about the internet was just wrong. It was just absolutely wrong about what people are going to do, how they're going to do it, why they're going to do it. And the same thing is true of AI. Like
to interject on that, to make it like really concrete, if anybody grew up like in the 90s or early 2000s and you went to like elementary school, there's probably a list of things you were not supposed to do. Just think back to when you're like 8 years old. Like, don't talk to strangers, don't take candy from strangers, don't get in a stranger's car, don't go to a stranger's house. And those are literally the biggest businesses on the internet, right? It's like Uber and Airbnb and DoorDash. And like literally all of the biggest businesses on the internet were all of the things you were not supposed to do.
And so I think what's so interesting is that if you had told us 5 years ago, a lot of people who are working in machine learning were very excited about the advent of AI and creating human level intelligence that would be super cheap. And if you were to tell them, 5 years later, we're going to have PhD level intelligence on demand for $20 a month. Actually, free for most people, but you can get this for $20 a month. How many people in the U.S. would you expect to start using this? The answer is that in the US, less than 20% of people have used an LLM in the last year. That means 80% of people can't think of anything they would use that for. They were like, okay, I guess that's cool, but like, how could it possibly help me in my life? And the US is the highest of all countries. So if you go to like a random country in Europe, it's like 7% of people have used an LLM in the last year, which basically means that what we would think is like, this is so obviously the thing we've all been waiting for. And most people are like, you give me something more obvious to do other than like type into a prompt. And so what that tells you is that we have no fucking clue how this stuff is going to happen and who's going to use it and how they're going to use it, which means chill.
Yeah.
It means wait. You might see, but I can imagine harms. It's going to read your data. It's going to, there's blah, blah, blah. And it's like, yeah, almost certainly there were going to be bad things that happen, but you are going to want to wait until you understand the balance of pros and cons before you go in and start intervening and deciding how this technology is going to play out.
No,
Okay,
nothing
cool.
to add.
Awesome. Thank you, Haseeb and Avichal, for your time. Time is up.
Thanks, everybody.